Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Let's look at Week 5 action. We have 4 teams on bye: the Los Angeles Chargers, Cleveland Browns, Seattle Seahawks, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And before we hop into this London game, reminder, subscribe, 5-star like, check out the 33rd Team Podcast Network on Apple, Spotify, and the Fantasy and Betting YouTube channel for the 33rd Team. The London game is the Jacksonville Jaguars at, in quotes, the Buffalo Bills. Game total is pretty high at 48, and the line right now is -5 in Buffalo's favor. It actually opened at the Bills -5.5, and as we talked on Monday, as you astutely pointed out, Ryan, the Jaguars played in London last week. They did not travel back. There's going to be some type of advantage there. Talk to me about how you think that affects this game, and if you think the Jaguars might be able to cover in this one.
I mean, anyone who's flown cross country before knows, like, you get off the plane, you're not exactly 100%. So these guys are used to this to a degree, but England's a different animal. And the other thing here is, Josh, is it's never happened before. No team's ever played 2 games overseas before. So I'm not exactly sure how to quantify the advantage, but it's definitely not a positive for Buffalo.
When I'm looking at the Bills defense, they've actually sneakily given up a league high 6 yards per carry to running backs. I think Travis Etienne could be in for a pretty huge game here, assuming they can keep it close. Again, he is acclimated to this time difference. And then one thing to note on the other end is that the Jaguars are giving up nearly 14 yards per reception to receivers, the 9th highest rate in the league. And the Jaguars have allowed the 3rd most pass plays of at least 40 yards. If you're thinking like I'm thinking, this could be a sneaky Gabe Davis week for DFS. And if you need an upside flex play, what else do you want to add here about this marquee matchup between Trevor Lawrence and Josh Allen?
Just in general, Buffalo's won 3 games by considerable distance. They're red hot. I think the traveling across to London's a bit of it's kind of an unwanted variable in this game, unless you're a Jaguars bettor. Trevor Lawrence can conceivably hang with anyone. The Jaguars gave Josh Allen a tough game a couple of years ago too defensively. The defensive end duo is fast, so that's at least a bit of a positive when you're facing a guy like Allen. So I'm not sure Jacksonville beats Buffalo, but I think they're going to give him a game and cover here.
Yeah, Ryan talked on Monday, and Ryan said it looks like it might be underdog week. And if you agree and you like the Jaguars, go to mybookie.com, use promo code 33rd Team, because we talked about how it's the line is -5. It is -5.5 on MyBookie. I would recommend taking the Jaguars at +5.5. That's quite a few points. Again, they will not be traveling to London. They are still in London. As someone who has been to Europe before, it took me about a week to acclimate there and back, which meant that the entire time I was there, I had terrible sleeping patterns. These are pro athletes. They're probably going to be affected in some form by it. Something very important to keep our eyes on. MyBookie, promo code 33rd Team. Get that 10% deposit match. Turn to our next game. It's the Houston Texans at the Atlanta Falcons. Game total is 41.5. Falcons are 1.5-point favorites. This was at 41, so the game total, it's moving up just a little bit. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think Nico Collins is starting to look like a sell in fantasy. He's averaging 21 fantasy points per game, which is 7th most in the NFL. But my expected fantasy points model, which looks at usage, the types of targets, the types of usage he's getting, does not have him as the 7th best receiver in the NFL for fantasy. He's down at 28th. Turns out when you're only getting 8 targets a game with good but not exceptional air yards, that's what's going to happen. And this Atlanta secondary, it was a sieve last year. Now they're giving up just 114 yards a game to receivers. That's the 3rd lowest. On the other side, this past week was very exciting. If you are a Bijan Robinson enthusiast, which I think most of us are, he tripled the snaps of Tyler Algier. It was kind of a 60-40-ish type committee in terms of how often they were on the field. That became a 75-25 type split last week. The Texans are allowing over 25 fantasy points a game to running backs this year. That's 7th highest. I think we'd agree that in terms of running back talent, Bijan is top 3. In terms of offensive line and run blocking, the Falcons are also towards the top of the league there. any notes here where I think we have one of the more lopsided young quarterback battles, Ryan. Why don't you touch on that? CJ Stroud, who's been crushing it, and Desmond Ridder, who I remember Monday you said is looking like the league's worst starting quarterback. Although, spoiler, we're going to see some Mitch Trubisky this week.
Houston's been great the last 2 games. They beat both the Steelers and the Jaguars by distance, which is surprising to me, that's for sure. The Texans' running game's been very ineffective due to their injured offensive line, but it hasn't been a problem for Stroud. Who could say anything negative about Stroud? The one thing I'll say from a production standpoint, I've mentioned this a few times, is late in both of these games against the Jaguars and Steelers, Stroud had a 50-plus yard touchdown pass when they were up by 2 scores. I don't think that's, I just, that 100-yard and 200-yard, that 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, I'd kind of slop off when projecting his future production. That said, who could have asked for more from Stroud from this point? And on the other side of things, like you said, Atlanta's a good team, solid defense, very good running game, both in terms of their offensive line and the running back duo. But ultimately, how far this team goes is on Desmond Ridder's shoulders. And 1, he hasn't done anything, and 2, it doesn't seem like they trust him at all. So that said, I do think this is a solid matchup against Houston's run defense, who was really bad last year. A little better under DeMeco Ryans, but I actually kind of like Atlanta a little bit in this one.
One thing that I think a lot of us will be curious about, especially in Superflex leagues, is whether or not Taylor Heineke is going to get any starts this season. To this point, they have committed to Ridder, but I would not say that any of us have seen any flashes so far to think that Ridder actually gives them the best chance to win these games. Let's turn now to the Carolina Panthers at the Detroit Lions. Game totals at 44. The Lions are 10-point favorites. They opened up as 8.5-point favorites, and the bettors said, I know you were on this earlier this week. I think the Lions are going to smash them. Boy, I assume you agree there? Yeah.
No
pushback?
No,
is this the right number now, or do you think it's going to move even more?
I think 10's fair. I mean, the Panthers have been bad. They've been borderline unwatchable, and Detroit's a complete football team. They can beat you in the air. They can beat you on the ground. Their ascending defense has been very good. So the question is, are the Panthers going to be a brand new football team this week? That's the only way they stay in this game, really.
Yeah, when we look at the Panthers, I guess the one good thing we could talk about for fantasy would be Adam Thielen. 3 straight games with a target share of at least 25%. His average depth of target's a little bit below 8 yards. That's not too far from the line of scrimmage. He's probably going to be the security blanket once again for Bryce Young. This Detroit defense is tough. They are getting pressure on quarterbacks, 40% of their dropbacks. That is top 7 in the league. And then when we look at the other side, I posted a tweet earlier. I think I made a lot of Jahmyr Gibbs fans upset that ultimately this guy is simply just not getting work. He's been targeted on 30% of his routes, 5th best at the running back position. He's running the 32nd most routes, though. So that feels a little Kyle Pittsian. And then on the ground, 15th highest yards per carry, 38th most carries per game. I think we're having a little bit of Kyle Pitts deja vu on the running back side, where we have a supreme talent who's not getting the work. I make that parallel mostly in jest because, again, it's only week 4. I remember looking at Alvin Kamara, who I think everyone compares him to. Alvin Kamara really kind of went nuclear in week 5 onward. I'm not saying this is the Gibbs week where he's going to go nuts, but I don't think we should panic too much yet. And I released rest of season rankings and a trade value chart on the 33rdteam.com. They're free. And you'll see that I am not quite panicking on Jahmyr Gibbs. Many out there are panicking. They think he is truly worthless. I wouldn't suggest buying low across all your leagues. This isn't really someone that I think, if you're a conservative manager, you want as a large part of your portfolio. However, if you're especially in a tournament setting, I know Ryan and I are in a lot of these fantasy football tournaments with big prizes up top. Gibbs does look like a nice player to send out a few feeler offers for. My trade value chart will help you, I think, essentially trade for Jahmyr Gibbs if you want to, given who I have him grouped with in tier 7. And then lastly, Jameson Williams will be returning from suspension. We are both very excited about that. Ryan, talk to me about how this Lions offense is going to look a little different with Jameson Williams rather than Josh Reynolds as their outside field stretcher.
You're just adding a dynamic athlete that can take the top off of a defense. Right now you have Amon-Ra, who's really good on crossers, drags, things of that nature. The running game's excellent. Sam Laporte is already a factor. Williamson's skill set's the one thing they don't really have. I'm very excited to see what pans out over the next few weeks.
And then tell me about Bryce Young. I mentioned before, Lions pressuring quarterbacks 40% of dropbacks. I'm quite concerned for Bryce Young. Do you think there's any path here for him in this Panthers offense to get going, or do you think this is going to be kind of a slog? Their implied team total is incredibly low. It is 17 points in this one.
Yeah, entering the year, I expected them to struggle through their first 6 games. It doesn't surprise me that they might go winless through the stretch. Then they have their bye. Then things get easier. That's when I'll be really, zeroing in on Bryce Young. So far, he doesn't have a lot to work with. Not a very good wide receiver room. The offensive line's been worse than I think anyone would have expected so far. The running game's been pretty much a non-factor. So a lot of it's been on him. And he's shown some flashes. He does some things well, but it hasn't been pretty through the first month of the season.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter /X. Make sure you're following him there. Make sure you check out his power rankings that are up on the site. Make sure you check out his Thursday night preview if you're listening to this live when we get off air. Read through that. Some very, very good notes for that Commanders-Bears game. And he also has his expert picks and predictions out on the 33rdteam.com for free, where he walks through giving some cliff notes on every single week 5 game. And then check back with him on Saturday, where he'll be releasing his in-depth thoughts. You get to learn what Ryan might actually be betting on specifically, where he's going to dive a little bit deeper into all of these games. Let's turn to the AFC South divisional matchup. The Tennessee Titans at the Indianapolis Colts. Game total is at 43, which is up from 41.5. And then I think more interestingly is that when this opened, the Colts were 1.5 point favorites. That has flipped. Now the Titans are 2.5 point favorites. It moved 4 points. Ryan, what do you do when the line moves in this direction? And do you think that the betting community had it right that the Titans should in fact be favored?
Yeah, I think the Titans are going to win this game. Excellent veteran head coach, really good defensive front. They shut down Joe Burrow's offense last week, where a lot's riding on Anthony Richardson, a rookie quarterback, against a premium pass rush and an excellent head coach. A lot of things can go wrong in that scenario. I also think this is a good bounce back spot for Ryan Tannehill's passing attack against the Colts perimeter corner. So I don't want to bet on it now. I probably will still take the Titans in tournaments, but I don't want to bet it now that it's moved, since it's given me fewer outs in that. But I think this doesn't surprise me at all.
One very exciting note for Colts fans, Jonathan Taylor probably returns. I think we are all at least Jonathan Taylor fantasy enthusiasts whenever he's healthy. In my rest of season rankings, I have him in tier 3. That's very high. And I talk about how if he has a good week 5, he's skyrocketing pretty much immediately into tier 2 if he looks healthy. And I think he'd probably slot in just below someone like a Tony Pollard, because we loved Zach Moss, the usage he was getting. He actually looked pretty good. This whole offense has been quite solid in general. And I think Jonathan Taylor is just miles better essentially than Zach Moss in every single way.
Yeah.
And then one other Colts note. Speaking of my bookie, I was very interested in Michael Pittman over 58.5 yards, which is minus 110 on my bookie. Every other sports book I could find either had a higher receiving yards line or had it at minus 115. So if you want to pay the book less juice, which we always do, mybookie.com, promo code 33rdteam. Titans have a good pass rush, but they are also a pass funnel defense. Titans have allowed 7.8 yards per pass attempt, but just 3.1 yards per carry. I think Jonathan Taylor gets a good amount of work. I think he averages more than 3 yards per carry, but I still think it's an uphill battle to ultimately beat this Titans team on the ground. And I think Michael Pittman could be the guy here for a Titans team that really just has very little going on in that cornerback room. mybookie.com, promo code 33rdteam. Ryan, do you have any other notes for this game before we move on to another interesting divisional matchup?
Yeah, I think this game's primarily a trench matchup. Both defenses have a bit of an edge there, where if the offensive lines on both sides can mitigate that edge to a degree, I think this game has some interesting shootout potential. I'm also going to throw in that our guy Jordan Vannick's a little high on Alex Pierce this week. When Jordan likes someone that's a bit off the radar, I would definitely put him in your player pool.
That's a good point there. Everyone at this point, shiny new toy Josh Downs is very exciting. He's been getting the targets. Alec Pierce was taken in the second round last year. He does have 4.4 speed and size. Probably matches up pretty well with those Tennessee Titans corners. Turning to the AFC North, we have the Baltimore Ravens traveling to the Pittsburgh Steelers. This game totals at 38. It was at 40.5. It's dropped to 38. My thinking here is Mitch Trubisky starting over Kenny Pickett. The Steelers are 4-point underdogs here. I think this would have been a lot closer if it was Kenny Pickett. Again, Mitch Trubisky has to be one of the worst quarterbacks that you could start at this point for a team that hopes to stay in playoff contention. And on top of that, I don't know what's going on with Deontay Johnson. I do not believe he will return from IR. And then Pat Freiermuth at this point is officially doubtful with a hamstring injury. We could see a heavy, heavy dose of Najee Harris in this one. Is there any path here for this Steelers offense when it's Mitch Trubisky, George Pickens, and a bag of bones?
Yeah, Pickett might try to tough this one out. In that case, I think that changes this a little bit. But if it's Trubisky, I'm staying completely away from this game. But if Pickett's in, I don't really have high hopes. But I do think that they have a better chance of keeping this contest close in that scenario.
When we turn to the other side, the Steelers are 8th in pressure rate against quarterbacks this year. Zay Flowers has an average depth of target of only 6 yards. That's incredibly low. This could be a big game from him, seeing a lot of targets from Lamar Jackson. Potentially the same for Mark Andrews. And then one other player of note for the Ravens is Gus Edwards. Nearly a bell cow role in week 4. Maybe Justice Hill and Melvin Gordon are more incorporated this week. However, the Pittsburgh Steelers have given up 5 yards per carry this year, the 4th highest among all defenses. This interior defensive line does not look good. I do not believe Hayward is returning this week. What do you see as the path for the Ravens in this one?
Just in general, Lamar Jackson struggled against Pittsburgh in his career. Oddly enough, I think he's only played 4 games against them, despite being in the league for like 5-6 seasons. He just misses a lot of these games. But Pittsburgh goes zone heavy on Lamar, and maybe one day this will change. Lamar Jackson's right arm does not drive this offense; his legs do. So zone's bad for running quarterbacks. Pittsburgh's used to him. That's the primary reason they can keep him in check. So ultimately, if you're betting, this is a game as a sports bettor where I saw the line to this where I'm taking the Steelers or I'm staying away from it. Right now, I'm leaning towards staying away from it.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Check out all his content. It's free on the 33rdteam.com. You can find my Week 5 fantasy rankings up on the site. You can find my rest of season rankings and trade value chart on the site. And you should also be hopping into the 33rd Team Discord. We've got prop bets for you. We've got start set analysis. We've got trade questions. Ryan and I spend a few hours each week fielding a lot of those questions, combing through everything for the good people. That Discord is free, as I mentioned, and it's linked in all the articles on the 33rdteam.com, as well as our Twitter bios. Let's turn to Saints at Patriots. Game total is low. It's in the 30s, 39. The Patriots are 1-point underdogs, but it actually opened as the Patriots favored by 1.5. It has now shifted 2.5 points in the Saints' favor. Speaking of the Saints, Alvin Kamara is my running back 9 rest of season. How could he not be top 10? He had 11 of 13 running back carries last week, 14 targets. Derek Carr's shoulder does not seem fully recovered from the AC joint sprain that he had 2 weeks ago. I know one thing I'm going to be looking at in the props market is some of those Alvin Kamara receptions props. We'll be leaning over depending on what the line comes out at. And despite the Patriots generally being a tough matchup for running backs, I still have Kamara even this week in my top 10 simply because of the role. And again, there's a few teams on bye. Alvin Kamara is exactly the type of running back that you want. So he's kind of the hammer for anyone that stashed him for those 3 weeks during his suspension. What are you expecting from the Saints in what's going to be a really tough test where, like I mentioned before, Derek Carr might not be 100% still?
Yeah, he's playing through a throwing shoulder injury. It showed up on a few downfield throws last week. Give him credit as a leader, but even still, I'd rather have injured Derek Carr than Jameis Winston from a reliability standpoint. What I find interesting in this contest, and it's probably why the line shifted, is New England's defense is down some of their difference makers. Christian Gonzalez is going to be out. Going to be down a few other corners potentially. And the big one is Matthew Judon is the best pass rusher in the league. That isn't a household name. He's going to be out maybe for the rest of the season. So the Saints defense can potentially win this game, and their offense is getting a bit of a gift here with the Patriots injury situation.
Yeah, things are desperate because the Patriots actually traded back for J.C. Jackson from the Chargers. Yeah. J.C. Jackson was a healthy scratch with the Chargers, who do not have some elite pass defense, and now he's back with the Patriots. That is kind of the state of their affairs. When I look at the Saints against running backs, only 1 of 4 games this year did the Saints allow more than 4 running back receptions for a team. And we kind of need that from Ramondre Stevenson. It's a low game total, 39, probably not a lot of touchdowns. And then we look in the receiving game and we're like, oh, it's not a great matchup. And then we look at his backfield mate, Ezekiel Elliott, who ate pretty heavily into the routes run of Ramondre Stevenson this past week. I have Ramondre down at RB22 for this week. He's totaled only 13 fantasy points over his past 2 games. I am not super optimistic. Ryan, what is the path for the Patriots in this one? I assume you'll agree that it's probably going to be a little more on Mac Jones this week.
Yeah, I'd say it's like I'd actually call it narrow to non-existent. One concerning thing for me last week was, New England got blown out in Dallas. That's fine. That happens sometimes. But they pulled Mac Jones in the third quarter, put Bailey Zappi in. So facing a tough Saints defense this week where I don't really see like a good matchup advantage for them at all. I'm wondering if Mac Jones gets pulled again and if we're talking about a quarterback controversy next week.
Those are some bold fighting words right there. Let's turn to the Eagles at the Los Angeles Rams. This is a high game total at 49.5. We're about to scrape 50. It started at 48 and it just ticked up. And while the Rams opened as 5-point underdogs, that has now moved to them as only 4-point underdogs. Rams getting a little more respect. Cooper Kupp might end up suiting up in this one. Matthew Stafford, you've mentioned that he's been a borderline MVP candidate with his play this year. He's thrown for 300 yards in 3 of 4 games. The other game he didn't. He hit 269 yards. Matthew Stafford at this point, over 17 games, is pacing for more than 5,200 passing yards, just 13 passing touchdowns. Positive regression should hit Stafford, should hit these Rams receivers. I'm quite optimistic about Cooper Kupp when he returns. I've become a little more optimistic about Puka Nacua rest of season, given how good this offense has looked. Tutu Atwell looks like a sneaky good field stretcher, similar size to Marquise Brown, and so far he's been holding up nicely this season. Do you think the Rams give the Eagles a game, kind of like Vegas is starting to think they might?
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me because, from the Eagles' pass rush could blow this game apart, and even their secondary even could have their best game of the year because give Puka Nacua all the credit in the world, but the fact that this guy's leading the league in every major receiving category, I don't think that's going to last, especially not when Cooper Kupp returns. But ultimately, this game boils down to the pass rush. The Rams managed things well against the 49ers in this regard, so there's some hope on that front, but that gives me quite a bit of pause in this particular game.
When we look at the Eagles, I'm just going to talk about someone we both like, DeAndre Swift. He's averaged 20 fantasy points a game the past 3 weeks as the starter. The Rams are allowing the 10th most yards per carry to running backs. We know just how good this offensive line for the Eagles is. You'll notice on the 33rdteam.com that my fantasy rankings are no longer actually my fantasy rankings. So I kind of lied to you earlier. Sorry, listeners/viewers, because you now get aggregated ranks from not just myself, but Matthew Hill and Kevin Wheeler, 2 of the best to do it, along with myself. We have the average ranks, and you will actually see all 3 of us independently had DeAndre Swift as a top 8 option ahead of this game. Still think he's someone you should be trading for because it's very hard to find quality running backs for fantasy right now. And I think DeAndre Swift, just because these past few seasons, still has just enough stink to his name that you might be able to pry him from an unsuspecting fantasy manager. In my rest of season rankings, I have him tier 3. I think that's aggressive, and I think it's very, very well deserved. Anything you want to add here about the Eagles? And to me, at least, it feels like they can kind of beat the Rams both through the air and on the ground. So it kind of makes sense why this game total is so high.
Yeah. Most of the spreads that have moved this week, I kind of like the side that it moved towards, I get it. With this one, I'm a little bit surprised because from a pure talent standpoint, Philly could roll the Rams. This is basically all entirely on Sean McVay and Matthew Stafford at this point. They've worked miracles to make this team 2-2. Now you get the Rams coming off an overtime game. They have trench disadvantages on both sides of the ball. And, then on top of that, you have A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, DeAndre Swift, Dallas Goedert with Jalen Hurts. The Rams' no-name defense has played really well, given, their talent. But they're at a big disadvantage in basically every position group against Philly's offense.
Let's turn to the Cincinnati Bengals at the Arizona Cardinals. My goodness, if this was 4 weeks ago, we might be thinking the Bengals would be close to 2-touchdown favorites. But we've all seen how feisty the Cardinals have been. We've all seen how disappointing the Bengals have been. This game total's gone up from 42.5 to 44.5, but it opened Cardinals plus 3.5, and it has moved to Cardinals plus 3. The money is coming in on the Cardinals to lose by only a field goal. I mean, my goodness, what a season so far for the Bengals. T. Higgins has broken ribs. Tyler Boyd's going to try and fill in, but Tyler Boyd, his yards per route run is 73rd among 88 qualified wide receivers. He might be cooked. I guess we'll see on Sunday if he can fill in and command some targets. It's really all bad. And then on the other end, something that I found pretty interesting, the Bengals defense has allowed 9 pass plays of at least 20 yards the past 2 weeks, tied with the Vikings for the most in the NFL during that stretch. Dare I say it, Marquise Brown, once again, solid option in fantasy. Joshua Dobbs has been playing quite well. Give me your thoughts on this game from both perspectives. I know that you actually do not think the Bengals are going to smash, because I think a lot of people might say Bengals -3 seems like the bet of the century. And I think you would actually caution people pretty heavily there.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I would make this a Bengals or pass kind of game, especially now that it's 3. If it was 3.5, you get more outs there. But the Bengals absolutely need to have this game. They're a championship caliber team. You know, they've gone to the AFC Championship 2 weeks in a row. One thing that I find pretty interesting is Joe Burrow wasn't on the injury report when I looked earlier today. That's fascinating. I don't know how that's possible, really. So we'll see. We'll monitor that. We'll see what happens there. Desperation, I like. That component I like from Cincinnati. And I also think this game is on their defense to step up. The Cardinals' offense has been solid, but they're not exactly blowing the doors off anyone. So if they can keep this game around 20 points given up, Cincinnati should be able to win this one. Almost has to win this one.
Let's turn now. Many of you know at this point that I podcast with Mr. New York Giants himself. Ryan, he's a troubled fan. They make it hard. And the Giants are traveling to Miami to face the Dolphins. The game total's at 48. It opened at 49.5 and it dropped to 48. Also, the spread opened at Dolphins favored by 9.5. It's moved to Dolphins favored by 11.5. I'm not quite going to do the math on air right now, but we're projecting, I mean, what is that, like roughly 15, 16 points with the Giants? About 30 for the Dolphins. This is a real crazy one. Fortunately for Giants fans, we'll give you a little bit of good news because we just made fun of you. Saquon Barkley was limited in practice yesterday and today, Thursday. I think he might suit up. I'm a little bit concerned about his effectiveness off the high ankle sprain. I think for real football, at least, it's going to give some breathing room to Daniel Jones. Defenses play them a little differently when Saquon's on the field. This Giants offensive line, though, has been terrible. Myself and Matthew Hill have him ranked in fantasy as the RB17. And then Kev Wheeler's actually a little more pessimistic and has him at RB20. Essentially, none of us think Saquon is anything more than a fantasy RB2 in a matchup where I do not believe game script is going to be in his favor. There's no real path to the Giants winning this one, Ryan. What is the path, at least, to them covering plus 11.5?
Well, let me first say this. This dawned on me when I was watching Monday Night Football. It's been 10 years where I've hated watching the Giants play. I watch every game, since 2014, every snap, every game. The Giants are genuinely one of my least favorite teams to watch. And last Monday was absolutely brutal. Obviously, the Dolphins have been heavily bet already. That's why the lines moved. That makes sense. The Giants really have 2 paths in this game to making this close. The first one is Dexter Lawrence and their interior defensive line creates some havoc, creates some margin against the Dolphins' injury-reduced offensive line. If Connor Williams in particular can't play, that's a problem for Miami. And the second one is this. This dates back into college for Daniel Jones. When Daniel Jones can execute a quick hitter, pressure-sensitive game plan where you get the ball out fast, he did it in college. He did it against the 49ers to a degree too in the first half where he didn't play particularly well, but they kept the game manageable for a little while. They played Seattle more straight up last week. That if there's one flaw in his game, it's that he's terrible in pressure management. He has poor instincts. And, not all of it was his fault. The offensive line was terrible. There were a lot of times where he basically avoided an initial sack and then someone else hit him immediately. So those kind of situations aren't on him. But in this game. Expect them to play the Dolphins more like they played the 49ers. I don't think they're going to win under any circumstances, really, but maybe they can keep this closer than last week was.
Ryan, take a quick breath. Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. Talk to me now about the Dolphins side of things. This feels like another game where we could see 5+ touchdowns from this offense.
Yeah, if their offensive line has played well, but again, they're dealing with multiple injuries now. If they can play well, Wink Martindale brings heat too, like bringing heat against guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You could have 3 scoring drives on 3 plays potentially against this team. So you throw in A-Chain, who's gone crazy in the last 2 weeks. The ceiling for the Dolphins offense is 40+ points in this game.
Speaking of Devon A-Chain, however we'd like to say his name, if you go to mybookie.com, use promo code 3013, then we can take Devon A-Chain. Over 51.5 rushing yards. It's -109 on my bookie. That is the least amount of juice that I have found for this over. I have seen it as high as -125 already on other sports books. -109. That sounds a lot better to me. He had 18 carries for 203 yards in week 3. Then he only had 8 carries, but 101 rushing yards in week 4. The Dolphins were blown out by the Bills. It makes sense why they wouldn't run the ball that much, but we saw that the team's willing to give him up to 18 carries. He only had 8 last week. He's now fresh for week 5. Dolphins 11.5-point favorites. That's a great game script. I think A-Chan can hit this on 7 to 11 carries, but I think he's probably getting closer to 12 to 15 rush attempts. When we look at the Giants, they've allowed at least 102 rush yards to running backs in every game. The lead back has totaled at least 70 rushing yards in each game. And the Giants, as we alluded to, are coming off an awful loss on Monday Night Football. Again, Monday. That means they're on 6 days rest. MyBookie.com, promo code 3013. Get that deposit match of 10%. And you can use that little extra cash money on Devon A-Chan to hit a nice rush yards over. Let's turn to, we'll call this the game of the week for fantasy points. The Kansas City Chiefs at the Minnesota Vikings. Game total has stayed firm in the 50s at 52.5. It opened at Vikings 5.5-point underdogs. It's now moved to the Vikings only +4. This feels like maybe a little bit of a get-right game for the Vikings based on that line. How do you see the Vikings shaking out in this one?
We've talked about this all year so far. Minnesota's a dangerous 1-3 team, but they're kind of pigeonholed into Kirk Cousins' passing attack. If they exceed expectations, Minnesota has a good shot against anyone. If they don't, they have very few ways of beating you. So this one's ultimately on the Vikings offense.
When we look at the Vikings, Kirk Cousins had 344 or more passing yards those first 3 games before just 140 last week. I think he bounces back. And then one thing that I think is interesting is that the Chiefs have actually kind of struggled against running backs this year. Alexander Mattison now has at least 17 carries and at least 93 rushing yards in back-to-back games. That said, it was the Chargers, it was the Panthers. Those are pretty easy matchups. But the Chiefs have struggled against running backs. We just saw that with the Jets. The Jets were not just reasonably efficient through the air with Zach Wilson, but Breece Hall was averaging nearly 10 yards a carry in that game. So if the game stays close, we could potentially see another Alexander Mattison performance. And then on the other side, I'm going to call this the get-right game for Patrick Mahomes. Through 4 games, Mahomes has topped 300 yards once, 25% of the time. But if we look at his career stats, his 83 career games, in those games, he has reached 300 yards 42 times. That is more than half of his games. That's just a mind-blowing stat. It shows how dominant Mahomes has been. More than half the time, he has over 300 passing yards. I like to think that he ends this game 2 for 5 on the season of reaching 300 yards. Are you reasonably optimistic as well about a Chiefs passing attack that has simply not looked like the league's most efficient passing attack like they were last year?
Yeah, interestingly enough, Travis Kelce's obviously Travis Kelce, but is he, and this is a serious question actually, Josh, I don't think he's completely focused on football right now.
I noticed that too. Mahomes, Kelce on the wrong page. I think it was two, if not 3 targets last week against the Jets where it was fairly obvious that some kind of communication lapse happened. Ryan, what do you think that is? You've watched every snap of every game for the past decade. What do you think could possibly be on Travis Kelce's mind?
Right. I think they're fine, but I do think there's absolutely no way he's as zeroed in as he usually is right now. More importantly, I actually think Isaiah Pacheco is the second biggest difference maker on the Chiefs offense. I love the guy personally. He has no regard for his own safety. Fast, explosive player. I love the dude. As far as their wide receiver room goes, I think we'd both agree on this. Rashee Rice probably has the most upside long term. I do think they're going to play well against Minnesota. Normally I fade the highest game total every week, but this one I'm going to lean into it a little bit in DFS. Like Kelce in this matchup, like Hawkinson on the other side. I think both teams could actually hit 30 points in a best case scenario.
Producers are in my ear. They want us to say those two words for clicks. Taylor Swift. All right, moving on now to the New York Jets at the Denver Broncos. This game total is 43.5. It's gone up 1.5 points recently. And when this opened, it was Broncos 2.5 point favorites. It's now Broncos only 1.5 point favorites. A little bit of money coming in on the Jets. They had a pretty encouraging performance in primetime on Sunday night against the Chiefs. And I think at this point, I think we both agree that the Broncos might have the worst defense in the NFL. And to that extent, I would say if there was a week, this is the week to stream Zach Wilson. This is the week to start Breece Hall. I think he's a borderline fantasy RB1 type. And it's also the week to play Garrett Wilson if you haven't been able to trade him away. I have him ranked as a fantasy wide receiver 2 firmly this week, even though he's been mostly in the wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 4 cusp, given that it's Zach Wilson, given just how bad this Jets pass offense has been, and given how few pass attempts they've let Zach Wilson have. I think they might let it rip a little bit in this one. And then on the other end, I am still on Marvin Mims' watch. He hasn't topped 12 routes in a game this year. Starters, for context, are usually going to get 30, 35, 40 routes run per game. He hasn't gone over 12. This Jets defense is really, really tough. They're going to need a couple big plays because it's probably hard to sustain drives against them. Hopefully, Marvin Mims can start to flirt with 20 routes in a game. And then one thing that I think's interesting, you and I just had very little interest in both Samaje Perine and Jaleel McLaughlin this week and on waivers. I have them ranked as fantasy RB3 types, and this just in. Javonte Williams did not practice yesterday. However, when I looked, it appears he was a limited participant in practice Thursday. I am not going to fully rule him out from playing. So hopefully you did not spend too much fab on waivers on either of these Broncos running backs, just like we recommended on Tuesday. It is not an exciting situation. What is the path here for the Jets? Because I think they're looking like they match up pretty well against the Broncos in this one.
Yeah, I actually think this is kind of a nightmare matchup for Denver in a lot of ways. You have the Sean Payton angle where he talked negatively about Nathaniel Hackett needlessly, so that if the Jets like that guy at all, that's a fired up locker room this week. They just gave the Chiefs everything they could handle in front of Taylor Swift, so fired up again. And let's tackle this from two different angles here. First, the Broncos offense versus the Jets defense, a literal nightmare matchup for Denver. I don't see any, when I think of matchups in general position groups, I don't think the Broncos have an advantage anywhere. To the Javonte Williams thing, I'm going to say this out loud. I don't think Javonte Williams is that good. I don't think it matters if he plays or not. I've never really been on him. I don't really care. So that's a non-factor to me. Now, on the other side of things, maybe the biggest surprise of the whole year. The biggest surprise of the whole year is probably that after 4 weeks, Puka Nacua is leading the league in every relevant receiver game. That's probably the biggest surprise. Him being productive, cool. That surprising. Denver's defense, I don't know what happened to these guys over the offseason. I don't know what's going on. Like I told you before we came on the show, seeing Cole Kmet running deep posts and achieving 5 yards of separation, guys wide open in Chicago last week. I don't know what's happening, but if Zach Wilson is a career day this week, it wouldn't surprise me. If Garrett Wilson went crazy, it wouldn't surprise me. If Breece Hall went crazy, wouldn't surprise me. I took the Jets to win outright in expert picks. So it wouldn't even surprise me if they did so by a little bit of margin.
And then on the other end, we've talked a few times about how Russell Wilson's looked, not hard to do, but he has looked better than the disaster that was last year. He's not facing the Jets defense. This kind of feels like the game where he comes back to earth. Not saying that he is back to last year's version of Russ, but he's played pretty well, and the fantasy stats have actually been half decent. This feels like the end of the line in week 5, where maybe he bounces back in future weeks, but this feels like the week that you should not be playing Russell Wilson in fantasy. Do you agree that this could be a tough day for this Broncos pass attack?
Yeah, I mean, I think Russell Wilson's played relatively well considering what he did last year in the first 4 games. But yes, I'd avoid him in just about anywhere that I could this week. It's a brutal matchup where the Jets have a lot of speed up front too, and that's going to hurt him when he tries to extend plays.
Let's turn to, I think this is probably the game Ryan's most looking forward to, Sunday Night Football. I see him nodding. There we go.
Yeah.
We almost got a smile out of him. It's the Dallas Cowboys at the San Francisco 49ers. Game totals at 45. 49ers are 3.5-point favorites. Neither of those numbers have moved. That is what I saw them open at when we did our Monday show. I am still not starting Dak Prescott in fantasy. This is another tough matchup. We haven't seen him hit the 20 fantasy point mark yet. I think he's going to have to wait at least one more week. The fantasy option that I am a little bit excited about, though, from the Cowboys is our own guy, Jake Ferguson. His average depth of target, it's so low. It's only at 4.5 yards. And I think that is exactly why he's going to get some heavy usage. He's seen over 6 targets a game. That's hard to find at the tight end position. My expected fantasy points model also coincidentally has him at 6th best usage per game among tight ends. I think Dak could be under some pressure. I think they're going to want to give him some nice layup completions. Jake Ferguson could be the guy, a top 12 option rest of season and then some. And I think in this matchup, he's kind of pressing towards mid-range fantasy tight end 1 status. Anything to add here on this Cowboys offense? And one more for you. Has Michael Gallup looked better than Brandon Cooks? Because in the stat sheet, he has been better than Brandon Cooks, which I think has probably been a surprise to both of us.
Yeah, definitely. I saw that last night actually when I was writing this game up. Jake Ferguson's actually like second on the team in, most usage, targets, I think target share, I think even receiving yards, where Gallup and Cooks have both been role players, and Cooks only, I think, has 66 yards over 3 games, I think is the exact number. So I definitely don't think he's as fast as he used to be so far. Maybe he's nicked up. I'm not sure. So my answer to that question would be, yeah, I think Michael Gallup has looked a little better than him. Part 2 is the 49ers are just an excellent team, great roster, probably the best roster in the league. Great front. You can't really run on them. They've been a little dicier so far this year than they normally are, but a lot of that's because when you're running, like when it's 3rd and 17 and you run a draw on 3rd down and you get 12 yards, like it jukes the numbers a little bit. Still, run fits matter in football. Tony Pollard has a great role, but this is a tough matchup for him. That said, I that's why I think this game, just like the game against the Cardinals, I think this game's primarily on Dak Prescott. And we all have hits and misses in fantasy, Josh. You faded Dak Prescott coming into the year. That's aged very well through 4 games. Dak Prescott usually doesn't play well in quote-unquote big games. It's tough to call week 5 a big game, but I don't have a lot of faith in Dak being better than he has been in the last 2 times when they've lost to the 49ers in the playoffs.
One thing to add, Brandon Cooks is now 30 years old. He sprained his MCL and knee ligament recently. Maybe he's not 100% healthy, but either way, that's certainly not something that you can just quickly recover from. He is looking like a pretty good player to drop in fantasy if you haven't already. And then if we look at the Niners side, this one surprised me. Ryan, Amari Cooper is the only wide receiver 1 in the NFL with a higher average depth of target than Brandon Ayuk this year. And I think that's very interesting because we generally think about this Niners offense as a little dink and dunk. And I don't even mean that in a bad way. I mean, when you have yak monsters like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and you have an efficient game manager and a Brock Purdy, why would you be pushing the ball too far downfield? So Brandon Ayuk's role has been awesome, getting a lot of targets and around 15 yards down the field. There's no Trevon Diggs. He's out for the season, so the star Dallas cornerback's no longer there. I kind of think that if the 49ers can stop Dallas's pressure, again, Dallas, the best pressure team in the NFL so far this year, pressuring quarterbacks on 47% of dropbacks, by far first in the NFL. But I think anytime that this offensive line holds up, this could mean some big things for Brandon Ayuk. Do you have a lean here on who has the best matchup among the big 4 in San Francisco, where it's Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle?
I'm going to say McCaffrey, but in terms of like better than normal, I think Deebo Samuel has a better matchup than anyone else just because of the routes he runs. And the other thing is the 49ers, if they play Dallas's front straight up, they're going to lose in a lot of matchups. So this is a scheme game. They haven't, well, no, they played the Steelers on opening day, but they jumped out to a big lead. So I think if the Cowboys are going to win this game, it's primarily through pressure. It's primarily through making Brock Purdy truly uncomfortable for one of the first times in his career. He hasn't had a meltdown game yet. Dallas can get to that point, but do I want to bet on that exactly? No. I just think that's Dallas's clearest path here is, like you said, through their pass rush.
Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. Nobody talks about football like Ryan, and nobody that I'm aware of has watched every snap of every game since 2014 and not just lived to talk about it, but lived to write about it in depth each and every week of the NFL season. Let's head up the final game, Ryan. Monday Night Football. Bit of a snooze fest. Sorry, folks. We've got the Green Bay Packers at the Las Vegas Raiders. Game total's 45, so there should be some points in this one at least. The Raiders, here's what I think's interesting. The Raiders opened as 2.5-point dogs. They are now only 1-point dogs. But here's why I think that is weird, because as an athlete myself, I work out most days. Sometimes I get sore. I need more time to rest. Remember, Green Bay was embarrassed against the Lions on Thursday Night Football. They're now playing on Monday night. This is giving Green Bay 11 days of rest. It is a bit strange to me that this would move in favor of the Raiders. Ryan, can you make sense of this? You said that you kind of anticipated most of the line movement. Did you anticipate this one moving actually in the Raiders' favor? And if so, talk to me about why 11 days rest is being outshined by another factor.
I took the Raiders a little by a small margin in expert picks. So just from like a sports bettor's perspective, Monday Night Football, I thought the Raiders were going to win this game going into the season. I pick every game for that too to arrive at win totals. Let me come at you from a few angles here. From the Raiders side, Green Bay struggles against the run. You have Josh Jacobs. They can lean on him in this matchup. Devontae Adams against his former team. I don't think he has a monster game, but he's practiced against these guys his whole career. So he's not a super dynamic athlete. That's not really his game. He's a technician. He's a smart player. So he'll be able to create some margin in that aspect. And Josh, you're a Chargers fan. If Jimmy Garoppolo was the Raiders quarterback last week, did the Chargers lose that game?
I knew this was going to get brought up. Yes, I think the Chargers might have lost this game. Thank you. Can we please move on?
Yeah, it's just Jimmy Garoppolo's not a world beater, but he's Aiden O'Connell.
Yeah, we saw Aiden O'Connell get sacked 7 times, fumble twice, pretty much do everything in his power to lose the game for them. So, I think Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be a pretty welcome sight for all those Raiders pass catchers.
Yeah. I personally hope to never see Aiden O'Connell in NFL field again after last week. But Jimmy Garoppolo, solid, unspectacular. I think they can make this a muddy game. Like you said, though, the 11 days rest off of bad loss when the Packers also surged in the second half. That does give me some pause, especially if they're getting Watson back healthy. They're getting Aaron Jones back at full strength. The Packers have a more talented roster, but again, Monday night in Vegas is anything can happen in a situation like that.
Yeah, Christian Watson returned last week on Thursday night. He now has 11 days to heal up and relax that hamstring. He only ran half the routes, but he was targeted once every 5 routes. That's a pretty good target rate. And he was targeted more than 10 yards down the field. So it's kind of clear that they want to keep some type of downfield role for him. This Raiders secondary is pretty rough. I think this could be a blow-up spot for him. I have Watson ranked pretty aggressively as my wide receiver 19 this week. I think if there was someone that I'd be pretty scared to leave on my bench this week, it would probably be someone like Christian Watson. I think the concern for me there, and because someone might be like, well, if you like him that much, why don't you rank him higher? The Raiders do have a pretty good pass rush. And if I remember correctly, I believe the Packers are down both the left tackle and the left guard for what I believe is the second week in a row. Ryan, can you confirm or deny this? And do you think that portends bad things for Jordan Love if the entire left side of the line is inactive?
I don't know if they're officially out or not yet, but yeah, Bakhtiari probably is. Actually, he is. If Elgin Jenkins also misses, yes, that's a problem for the Packers. Max Crosby's, I don't want to say top 5 pass rusher, but if he's not top 5, he's really, really close. Again, I wrote this in expert picks, I believe. If the Raiders are going to win this game, Max Crosby is going to have to end a few drives on his own.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. You can find me, Josh Larky, at JLarkyTweets. All of our content is free on the33rdteam.com. Make sure you're checking it out. Make sure you hop in the free Discord. Check out Ryan's power rankings, expert picks, all of his betting leans, his survivor leans. Check out my fantasy rankings. They also have rankings from Matthew Hill, from Kev Wheeler. I have my rest of season rankings and my trade value chart out on the 33rdteam.com. I don't want to toot the horn too much, but I think this might be the best version of it out there. And part of it is because of the mind of Ryan Reynolds. Ryan helped me. We tried to break them for an hour before we released them on the site, and we just couldn't break them. Every trade that we thought looked a little lopsided, we would tinker, we'd adjust a little bit. And at this point, I think we have a pretty solid product that I know I've used myself for multiple trades in my leagues. I'm not just putting this out as content. This is something that I use. I think Ryan and I would both agree. We're never creating content for content's sake. It is always stuff that if we were not working in this industry, would be consuming ourselves.
Yeah.
From myself, from Ryan Reynolds, Taylor Swift. We had to mention that a few more times. From mybookie.com, from the 33rd team, from Taylor Swift. Thank you, everyone.